These two questions are taken from PineCreek. He is a skeptic. I believe he's an atheist agnostic, and he's got somewhat of a YouTube presence, and he's asking a question. I think it's a good question, and would be a good opportunity for you to clarify. And so he asked the question regarding circularity. If you need God, let me put this up here. If you need God to justify logic, then you can't use logic to justify God without being circular. Does Scott agree? Perhaps you can say if you agree or not, and then kind of qualify that if you understand what he's asking.
Yeah, I mean, part of a good question. I think part of the issue here has to do with our terms. So let's not talk so much about need, but let's say, as I believe, that God is the one who creates everything that is, and including our way of thinking. And one of the ways that he has embedded our thinking is logically. That is, we are made to make distinctions. And when God made Adam and Eve, he made a distinction between Adam and Eve, and he made a distinction between Adam and Eve and creation and the different species that he created. All of that is God helping us understand that our thinking is analogous to his own thinking. So I think without that, again, as Bahnsen, I think, helpfully showed in his debate with Gordon Stein, without a foundation like that, then it's difficult for someone to show how the abstractions of logic actually fit in the created world. I think Van Til's famous phrase was, he called logic a turnpike in the sky. And somebody asked him, why do you use that illustration? Why is it a turnpike? Why is it in the sky? And he says, because you can't get on it. And what he meant by that is, in his study of logic, and I think it's still true, we're talking very generally here, but I think it's still true that logicians have a difficult time moving from the symbols to reality. So what is taking place actually in the world when things are changing? I mean, Heraclitus was right on one level. Everything that we see around us is changing to some extent, and so how do we think about those things? My eldest son is a philosophy student, getting a PhD in philosophy, and one of the courses that he took a couple of years ago was a course called Vagueness. And I said, "What?"
It's an entire course.
Yeah, it's a whole course. And I said, "What in the world is going on with vagueness?" And he said, "Well, it's the reality that we really aren't able all the time to think in a binary way, A and not A. So at what point, this desk in front of me, let's say I cut it in half, and now there's half a desk, but there's still a desk there that I can put things on it, and I just start slicing pieces of it, moving toward the edge. At what point does it cease to be a desk? Well, it's kind of vague. And there are a lot of answers to that. Maybe it's not a desk after you cut it in half. Maybe now you've got a half a desk. So you've got this kind of vagueness in reality that's not quite as conducive to A is not non-A as some people want to think. Now, having said that, we're made to make distinctions like A is not non-A. So I'm not saying at all there's anything wrong with those. I'm saying those things have to be grounded. And if they're grounded in the character of God, then we recognize, again, there's something transcendental that supersedes the subject and the object and helps us to recognize how properly to use logic.
Right. So real quick, Dr. Oliphint, why don't we simplify that then? So if someone says, if you need God to justify logic, then you can't use logic to justify God without being circular. Is that true or false? If it's true, is that an issue? Is it an issue of being circular when it comes to our ultimate foundations? Is it fallaciously circular to be circular with regards to our ultimate foundations?
Well, it's it's sort of like saying if your questioner used air to breathe in order to write his questions, that he's being circular in justifying the reality of air for life. There are certain things, as many philosophers have pointed out, whether you buy their arguments or not, there are certain things that are by nature circular because of the way God has created the world. Mm-hmm. And yes, there's a fallacy of reasoning in a circle when the circle is vicious, but circularity in and of itself is not logically fallacious.
Why don't you explain that for people? What's the difference between what people say virtuous circularity and vicious circularity? What's the difference there? And why is one fallacious and why is the other one not?
Yeah, well, I think the main reason is because in vicious circularity, you stop at a place where you've started, and in each of those, the stopping place and the starting place, there's no foundation or ground available to you.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the illustration of the dog chasing its tail, you know, why would you do that? That's kind of a viciously circular enterprise with no meaning, because why? You've got no context in which to make that meaningful. There's no foundation there in order to understand that properly. A virtuous circle, as we means that when you presuppose, as we do, that God exists and that he has spoken in his word, and then you don't even have to say that when you're in the midst of an argument, but then you start to discuss things with people about maybe who God is or what logic is with your questioner there, and how to think about logic. And that person says to me, so you're presupposing God in talking about logic, and so you're using logic in order to talk about God. And I would say, yeah, because there's no other position available to us in the world that God has made, and you and I as God's creatures. So in that sense, we're not in the midst of a vicious circle, but we're presupposing something. And then given that presupposition, we can talk about anything in the world. But just because we're talking about those things or using those things doesn't mean that the circularity nullifies the argument in any way, shape, or form. Again, it's like, prove to me the verifiability or the trustworthiness of the empirical. Prove that to me without using the empirical. You just can't do it. It's because we're made in a particular way. God's put us here in a particular way, and so there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way God has made man and woman.